All right. As I say, we're on page 20, and I just read the last little section. Ramakrishna, Rakhal had said he was hungry, and Ramakrishna called from the bank, "Gordasi, where are you? Where are you?" And she arrived with food, and then Ramakrishna was saying, come, eat, the food's here, you're hungry, and he got embarrassed. Once, while Rakhal was massaging Sri Ramakrishna with oil, he begged the master to grant him the power of transcendental vision. At first, Sri Ramakrishna took no notice of his request and remained silent. When Rakhal persisted, the master suddenly turned and spoke to him very harshly. Rakhal felt hurt and angry. He smashed the bottle of oil on the ground and ran away. But as he reached the gate of the temple, his feet suddenly seemed paralyzed. He could not move another step. Helplessly, he sat down on the road, not knowing what to do. Meanwhile, Sri Ramakrishna sent his nephew Ramlal to find Rakhal and calm his anger. Ramlal fetched Rakhal, who slowly returned to the master's presence. Sri Ramakrishna looked at him smiling. "Lee, you see, you could not go outside the circle I drew around you." Rakhal felt ashamed and remained silent. A few moments later, Sri Ramakrishna went into ecstasy and began to speak to the Divine Mother. "O Mother," he murmured, "I know you have given him 1/16th part of your power, and that power in him will benefit all mankind." For those of you that just joined, we're on page 21, top of the page now. Then, in the same ecstatic mood, he addressed Rakhal, saying, "You were angry with me. Do you know why I made you angry? There was a purpose to it. Medicine acts only after the sore has been opened." He continued, "Have faith that God is also with form and can be seen that way. God is revealed to the man who has controlled his mind." A few days later, while massaging his master's feet, Rakhal suddenly lost his external senses and was transported into that transcendental realm which he had longed to experience. In later years, Sri Ramakrishna used to point out the exact spot in the room where Rakhal went into samadhi for the first time. Narayan. Vivekananda met Sri Ramakrishna about 6 months after Rakhal's arrival. Rakhal and Narayan were happy to be together again at the feet of their master. But one day, Narayan was shocked when he saw Rakhal follow Sri Ramakrishna into the temple of Mother Kali and prostrate before the image. He remembered how Rakhal had signed the pledge of the Brahmo Samaj, promising not to worship images or forms of God. At the first opportunity, Narayan reminded Rakhal of his promise and reproached him bitterly for indulging in image worship. Rakhal was silent. How could he ever make Narayan understand what he had experienced through his master's grace? Yet he could not argue the matter. So for a few days, Rakhal avoided Narayan, and Narayan would not speak to Rakhal. Sri Ramakrishna noticed this, and when he learned the reason for the quarrel, he talked affectionately to Narayan and made him realize that Rakhal was not responsible for the change in his attitude toward images. After that, the boys became friends again. 2 days passed away in the holy company of Sri Ramakrishna, during which time Rakhal lived such an intensely spiritual inner life that he forgot all about his duty to his young wife. Shama Shundari, his mother-in-law, understood him. However, because of her own devotion to Sri Ramakrishna. Knowing how pure and devoted to God Rakhal was, She trained her daughter to be a worthy wife. A neighbor once said to her, "It seems your son-in-law is turning into a monk. Why don't you try to bring his mind back to the world for your daughter's sake?" "What can I do?" Shyama Sundari said. "Everything depends on the will of the Lord. If my son-in-law becomes a monk, I shall regard it as a great blessing." Soon after this, Shyama Sundari came with her daughter to visit Rakal and asked him to return home. The meeting took place in the presence of Sri Ramakrishna, who remained silent throughout. Later, the master described it to his other disciples and said, "Rakal has now reached true spiritual discrimination. I know he will no longer be attached to the world. He has realized the emptiness of earthly pleasures." The master felt, however, that Rakal had a duty to his wife and told him to visit her from time to time. Rakal obeyed. Gradually, his visits to his wife became longer. He felt concerned about her and her future. Finally, he came to Sri Ramakrishna and asked his advice. The master listened to everything he had to say, but refused to tell him definitely which path of life he should follow. With a heavy heart, Rakal went back to his wife and silently prayed to Sri Ramakrishna to show him the way. 3 days passed. Rakal prayed unceasingly. Suddenly, a veil was removed from his eyesight, and he saw the divine Maya, the play of the Divine Mother. He knew now which path to choose. He and his wife were not to be bound by the ties of marriage. He had a great mission to fulfill. He was certain now that his wife would be taken care of, and strangely enough, she also felt full of peace. So taking leave of her, he went straight back to Dakshineshwar. The master knew exactly what had happened. Silently smiling, he welcomed home his beloved spiritual son. Sri Ramakrishna had known that Rakal would not be bound by any earthly attachment. Yet there remained in him a subtle, lingering desire, a desire which could not be completely removed from his heart until it had had some satisfaction. That was why Sri Ramakrishna had sent Rakal back to his wife. Now he knew that henceforward Rakal would be completely free from desire in any form. Sri Ramakrishna used to say the virtue of truthfulness is most important. If a man always speaks the truth and holds to the truth tenaciously, he will realize God, for God is truth. I pray to the Divine Mother, saying, "Mother, here is knowledge, here is ignorance. Take them both and give me pure love for you. Here is purity, here is impurity. Take them both and give me pure love for you. Here is good, here is evil. Take them both and give me pure love for you." But I could not say, "Here is truth, here is untruth. Take them both." One day, Sri Ramakrishna said to Rakal, "I can't look at you. I see a veil of ignorance over your face. Tell me, have you done anything wrong?" Rakal was greatly troubled. No matter how hard he tried, he could not remember having done anything wrong. "Try to recall," Sri Ramakrishna said to his disciple, "if you have told any untruth." Rakal at once remembered and admitted that he had recently told a lie in a joking way to a friend. Sri Ramakrishna forgave him but said, "Never do it again. To speak the exact truth always is a most important spiritual discipline." Rakal's enthusiasm for the spiritual life did not weaken, but after a while he ceased to meditate regularly. Sri Ramakrishna noticed this and asked him the reason. Rakhal answered, I do not always get the inspiration. My heart seems dry and I feel an emptiness. You must never neglect your meditation on that account, Sri Ramakrishna told him. Make up your mind to practice spiritual disciplines. Then the enthusiasm will come naturally. Those who are farmers by birth and occupation do not and cannot give up farming just because the crops fail. So you must not give up meditation even though you may not get any apparent results. You must be regular in your practice. That same day, Sri Ramakrishna went as usual to worship in the temple. Rakhal followed him and sat down to meditate in the hall facing the shrine. Suddenly, he saw the shrine grow strangely luminous. The illumination increased in strength until it was as bright as the sun itself, but mellow, not dazzling. This light began to pour through the door of the shrine and seemed about to engulf Rakhal. He was on the verge of losing consciousness. The sensation frightened him. He got up and went out. Later, Sri Ramakrishna found him sitting silently in his room. Why did you run away? The master asked. You complain that your heart is dry and you don't have any more spiritual visions, yet you are afraid to experience anything. That's not right. A few days after this, Rakhal was sitting absorbed in meditation in the hall of the temple and experiencing an ecstatic joy. Sri Ramakrishna approached him in ecstasy and gave him a special mantram for his own use. Look, said the master, there is your chosen ideal. Rakhal, in ecstatic vision, saw his chosen aspect of the Godhead standing before him, living and luminous, with a smile playing on his lips. When Rakhal regained his external consciousness and saw Sri Ramakrishna, he prostrated at his feet with loving devotion. He had known and experienced the divine power and grace of his guru. Sri Ramakrishna returned to his room and Rakhal became once more absorbed in meditation. On another occasion, while Rakhal was meditating, his mind became very dry and restless. All his struggles to calm it were of no avail. Disheartened and disappointed at his own failure, he rose from his seat. Then Sri Ramakrishna came to him and said, I see an obstacle on your path. Put out your tongue. Rakhal obeyed. The master drew some lines on his disciple's tongue with his finger and said, Now go and meditate. At once Rakhal found himself freed from his distractions. Now I know distractions and a little dryness are common to practically everyone, occasionally. How easy it would be if we had Ramakrishna sitting right there and drawing on our tongue to take all the obstacles away. We, however, have to use firm determination and keep up the practice. During this period, Sri Ramakrishna taught his disciples many kinds of spiritual disciplines, and Rakhal used to practice them with great earnestness, but always in privacy and solitude. Often, when Sri Ramakrishna and his devotees were together, a mood of spiritual fervor would come over the whole group. Then Rakhal would go into ecstasy. Once at the house of Balaram, a disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, the devotees were chanting the name of God, and the master was in samadhi. Rakhal was in ecstasy, apparently unconscious. When Sri Ramakrishna came out of samadhi, he touched Rakhal on the heart and thus brought him back to normal consciousness. In the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, M., a close disciple, records some remarks the master made about Rakhal's spiritual condition at this time. Rakhal has grown into a very sweet character now. He practices japa unceasingly. That is the reason you see his lips moving sometimes. When I look at him and notice his mental condition, I often feel inspired and lose myself in ecstasy. Narayan, Rakhal, and a few others belong to the class of the ever-perfect. They are born with God knowledge. As they begin to grow up, they realize the emptiness of earthly pleasures. The Vedas tell us of a bird called the Homa. This bird lives high in the sky. It never comes down to earth. It lays its eggs in mid-air, but at such great height that the eggs hatch while still falling. The little bird comes out and finds itself dashing down toward the earth. When it sees the ground rushing to meet it, it soars up and rejoins its mother in the sky. Boys like Rakhal resemble the Homa. From their earliest childhood, they see the emptiness of the world, and their one thought is how to reach God. Sri Ramakrishna also remarked, Rakhal at one time became very sensitive to people. He could not bear the sight of those who were worldly minded. I too went through the same mood at one time. Rakhal had another mood in which he loved to be alone and taste the divine bliss in complete absorption. At such times, he told me he could not bear even my company. He came here to look after me, but while he was passing through this stage, I had to look after him. During this period, Rakhal had many visions and developed various occult powers. But following his master's advice, he learned to pay no attention to them. To quote his own words, "While I was with the master, a man who was living in the temple fell sick. He had no one to look after him, so I nursed him for a few days. One night, when I was sitting beside him, his suffering became intense. I did not know how to help him, so I thought I would repeat the Lord's name and pray for his relief. After I had practiced japa for some time, a kind of slumber overcame me. In that state, I saw a beautiful young girl about 12 years old standing before me. She had the look of a goddess. I asked her, 'Mother, will this man be cured?' She nodded and answered, 'Yes.' The vision disappeared instantly. Next day, the patient recovered. Just as the inside of a cupboard can be seen through its glass doors, so Rakhal could see into any man's heart. He was aware of the character and motives of everybody who visited the temple, and would refuse to allow any but sincere, earnest people to enter the master's presence. Sri Ramakrishna learned that Rakhal possessed this power and that he was using it. He scolded him severely, saying, "It is mean to use your power this way. He who pays heed to occult powers cannot live in God knowledge. Take no notice of such powers when they come to you." We've been told over and over again that occult powers and that kind of powers stand as obstacles to God realization. They're temptations to lead you astray. In later years, a man once complained to Swami Brahmananda, a disciple of Maharaj, that they were not really holy men because they did not possess occult powers. When this was reported to Maharaj, he said, "It is easy to acquire occult powers, but hard indeed to attain purity of heart. To find purity of heart is to know the real truth of religion." There now arose a new obstacle to Rakhal's continuous stay with the master. He became sick and was sent to Calcutta to live in the house of Balaram. Sri Ramakrishna wanted Balaram to take particular care of his disciple and told him, Boys like Naren and Rakhal are born for a divine mission. To serve them is to serve God. Balaram felt very happy to serve his master's spiritual child. But the climate of Calcutta did not agree with Rakhal. So, with the permission of Sri Ramakrishna, Balaram took him to Vrindavan for a change of air. At first, Rakhal felt better. He found Vrindavan very inspiring and wrote highly of it to M. What a wonderful holy place is Vrindavan. The wild peacocks are dancing all around. The air is full of singing and dancing and the praises of the Lord. Here you feel an unending joy in the holy name. Then he became seriously ill. This troubled the master. To quote Sri Ramakrishna's own words, I was extremely worried when I learned of Rakhal's illness in Vrindavan. Vrindavan is the holy place where Sri Krishna spent his youth. Since Mother revealed to me that Rakhal is the playmate of Sri Krishna and one of the shepherd boys of Vrindavan, I was afraid lest he should be reminded of his past incarnation. If he remembered his association with Sri Krishna while at Vrindavan, he might give up his body there. Therefore, I prayed fervently to the Divine Mother, and she assured me that I had no cause for anxiety. The Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna contains this reference to Rakhal's illness. Sri Ramakrishna speaks of Rakhal. While massaging my feet, Rakhal had his first ecstasy here. A scholar was with me, expounding the Bhagavatam. As Rakhal listened to the words of the scripture, he began to feel ecstatic joy. Then he lost consciousness and became absorbed in samadhi. He attained samadhi for the second time at Balaram's house. He fell on the ground, apparently unconscious. Rakhal is a devotee of a very high order. He dwells in the realm of the personal aspect of God. If he hears people talking about the impersonal, he goes out of the room. I prayed to the Divine Mother for his recovery. He has renounced everything, and he depends entirely on me. When he first went to Vrindavan, he wrote to M, saying how wonderful the place is and how the peacocks are dancing around. But now those peacocks seem to hold no charm for him. Why do I love these boys so much? Because their hearts are pure. When Rakhal returned from Vrindavan, he found that many new disciples had gathered around the master. Among them, he saw many of his old school friends. Soon after this, Sri Ramakrishna fell ill and was finally removed to the Kasipur garden house. Rakhal accompanied him. One after another, several of the young disciples went to live there and look after the master. It was during this last illness that Sri Ramakrishna established his monastic order and fired his young disciples with the ideal of renunciation. He began to train each one individually according to his character and temperament. To some he gave the Garawa cloth, which symbolizes the life of renunciation. Naren and Rakhal were among these chosen few. The master was undoubtedly a very sick man, but he still remained the source and center of a strong spiritual current which transformed the lives and characters of those around him. The Kasipur garden house became a place of bliss, and the disciples' hearts overflowed with joy in God. It was during this period that Sri Ramakrishna prepared Naren to deliver his message to mankind. He taught him how to train the young disciples and organize the monastic order. Every day he would talk to Naren for hours together. In the course of one conversation, he told him, Rakhal has the keen intelligence of a king. If he chose, he could rule a kingdom. Taking the hint and understanding that the master wanted Rakhal to be their leader, Narayan lost no time in bringing this about. One day, when all the young disciples were seated together, Narayan spoke of Rakal's greatness and announced, "From today we shall call Rakal our king." The others gladly agreed, knowing the special love which their master had for Rakal. Thus, from that day, they called him Raja, the king. Later on, both disciples and devotees began to call him Maharaj. When Sri Ramakrishna heard Rakal's new name, he joyfully approved. He knew that his mission had been fulfilled, so leaving his earthly body, he merged himself in the Divine Mother. On the 15th of August, 1886, the Master passed into Mahasamadhi, the highest state of superconsciousness. Now, does anyone have anything they'd like to say about it? This was a great deal of spiritual experiences in the first part of your taking up a spiritual path. Any comments? Any questions?
Krishna Prana, could I ask 2 questions?
Sure.
One, when they mentioned that Thakur gave him a mantra, that means that was the first time Thakur gave him a mantra, and later he wrote something on his tongue.
Yeah, they think that the thing on his tongue was to remove the obstacles to his concentration. It may have been another mantra.
Okay, and then why do you think that Thakur approved Rakal going to Vrindavan, knowing Rakal's nature, that it wouldn't cause some reaction being in the place where he was from? Because it mentions, we always hear that that's where if Rakal knows
if Rakal remembers his true nature, he will leave his body. I'm so worried.
Right. Yeah.
But he was also worried that Rakal would die in Calcutta because he was so sick.
Yeah.
He was taking care of it, who knows what. I don't know what God thinks.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I always thought about that. Everybody knew that was his nature, yet Thakur approved him to leave and go there with Balaram. Anyway.
But he did feel he was his son.
Right.
And he would do anything to protect him.
Right.
So, it's a good question. It's something to think about. Keeps your mind right on them.
Okay, sorry.
Which is all we want. Anyone else have any comments or questions? Well, we can start the next chapter I was just reading another book, and when they said that Thakur gave 11 Gerawa cloths out that time before he died. Mm-hmm. And it was Advaitananda who had brought 12 Gerawa cloths to him, and he took them. Thakur took them and gave them to 11 of his young disciples and saved one for Girish Ghosh.
Uh-huh.
So I can't remember what the exact 11 were, but I was just reading that in another book about Vivekananda. Then they took their sannyas vows on Christmas Eve, around a Duni fire at Premananda's home. Anpur, yeah. Okay, as a young monk, while the master was still with them, the young disciples had lived in an atmosphere of continual joy and festivity. They were walking the path of God, who is infinite being, infinite wisdom, and infinite bliss. They tasted the delight of their master's presence, and neither the anxieties of the world nor its pleasures and excitement could touch their hearts. Live in union with Brahman and spread the joy of Brahman all around you. That was the truth that the disciples had learned. In the Gospel according to St. Matthew 9:15, we read that Jesus said unto them, "Can the children of the bride chamber mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom shall be taken from them, and then they shall fast." Sri Ramakrishna was taken away from them, and they felt a void, an emptiness. The Master had, as it were, lighted the candles within their hearts with a torch of blazing fire. Now that the torch had gone, they were conscious of darkness. Their own candles still burned, but they were not enough. They wanted the blazing torch. They wanted to be merged in that blissful consciousness once and forevermore. Guided by an invisible hand, thirsting for God and fired with the ideal of renunciation, the young disciples gathered together and formed the Ramakrishna monastic order at Varanagore. Narayan was the center and heart of this group. Under his guidance, the young disciples engaged themselves in study, discussion, and religious practices. Rakhal was put in charge of the monastery and made responsible for its general welfare. Narayan and Rakhal loved and respected each other deeply. Once, a young member of the group felt discouraged and wished to leave. Rakhal said to him, "Why do you want to run away? There's such a wonderful atmosphere here. Where else would you find a holy man like Narayan? And where else would you find such love as Narayan has for us?" Although some members of the new monastery had already received the Garo cloth from their master, they now followed Narayan's suggestion and went through the formal ritual of sannyas, the taking of the monastic vow. Narayan became known as Swami Vivekananda, Rakhal as Swami Brahmananda. These were the first monks of the order, the immediate disciples. The disciples now devoted themselves wholeheartedly to spiritual practices. Some days they had nothing to eat, and always their meals were scanty. Their only thought was of God, and in this thought they would remain absorbed almost continuously for days and nights on end. In the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, M records the following conversation with Rakhal in the gardens of the Varanagore monastery. Rakhal, don't waste any more time. Plunge deep into spiritual practices. Why have we renounced the world? Some people say if you have failed to realize God, why not go back to the world? But Narayan gives the answer. Because we could not find Ram, must we live with Sham and beget children? Narayan speaks wise words. M, what you say is true. I can see that you are filled with great spiritual longing. Rakhal, how can I describe the state of my mind? This noon I felt a yearning to go to Narmada and practice austerities. Nothing can be achieved without diving deep into meditation. The outside world is full of distractions. Even Shukadev, the pure and ever-free one, was afraid of the distractions of the world. M. Yes, the Yoga-Upanishad describes how Shukadev renounced the world, the realm of Maya. It also relates a conversation between Shukadev and his father Vyasa. Vyasa advises him to find God while living his life in the world. Shukadev answers, the only truth is God. He saw the emptiness of life in the world, the vanity of lust and greed. Rakhal, many people mistakenly imagine that it is enough if one avoids the company of women. But Narayan expressed the truth beautifully last night. He said, woman exists for man as long as he has lust. When you are free from lust, you do not see any difference between the sexes. M. That is true. children do not see the difference in sex. Rakal, that is why I believe we must plunge deep within. To reach enlightenment, a man must transcend Maya, the domain of lust and greed. On the previous page, they gave a list of all the original disciples, which you see in the gospel all the time, and with their names, their sannyas names, Swami Vivekananda, Brahmananda, Premananda, Yogananda. And you see that the names, when you go to the gospel readings, they're other names, they're familiar names that are used often. The other interesting thing I found, they have Gopal Sr., Swami Advaitananda. He was 55 when he met Ramakrishna. Now, this man had been married. He was grieving for his wife who had died, and he felt the call to renunciation. But he was older even than Ramakrishna when he met him, and became one of the first disciples, dedicated his life. And they made an interesting connection there, that his advent in the play of Sri Ramakrishna was to encourage everyone that character and renunciation could take place whenever you found the call to God. It didn't have to be, as Ramakrishna kept saying in the gospel, I want young people because they must mold their minds when they're young. And the fact that Advaitananda was one of his direct disciples is proof that it can happen at any time. So it's never too late to take up the search for God. Now, I'm going to stop in the middle of a chapter again. I'll read a couple more pages. Most of the young disciples wanted to retire into complete solitude and live absorbed in God. The divine touch of their master had already enabled them to experience a transcendental state. What they had attained only now and then through his grace, they wished to win as a permanent possession by their own efforts. They wanted to live utterly in that consciousness. We find Swami Brahmananda eager to go into solitude, live on alms, and dwell constantly in the union with Brahman. Maharaj talked to Swamiji, as Vivekananda was usually called, about his intention of living for some time as a wandering monk, surrendering himself completely to God. Swamiji agreed, but suggested that Swami Subodhananda go with him and look after him. Because of his deep love for Maharaj, Swamiji was always concerned for his welfare and wished him to have someone who would minister to his comforts. Maharaj could not refuse his brother's wish, so he and Swami Subodhananda left together for Benares. They stayed there a month. From Benares, they went on to the temple of Omkarnath, situated on the bank of the Narmada. Here, amidst charming natural surroundings, Maharaj lived continuously in Nirvikalpa Samadhi for 6 days and 6 nights, completely unconscious of the outside world. When at last he came back to normal consciousness, his face shone with the heavenly joy. He had experienced God in the impersonal, absolute aspect, and had realized the identity of the Atman with Brahman. And I think we will stop there, because we read earlier that Maharaj dwelt in the realm of the personal God. And that's why Sri Ramakrishna was so concerned about him being in Vrindavan and recognizing his past incarnations with Sri Krishna, but now he has now experienced the non-dual transcendental experience of Brahman, which is not in the realm of the personal God. So now he's free to come back and help all of us. Any other questions or anything to do? Now, next week we will not have this, we won't do the reading of the Eternal Companion. We're taking 1 week off, and then we'll be back on the 21st. Okay. And Saturday we'll have the gospel reading at 5. And I think we're going to have a treat for you. I believe Swami Sarvadevananda is going to be reading it with us. Sunday, we don't have any lectures from Santa Barbara, but check out the website because there's always a lecture on. Okay. And we hope to see you all maybe Saturday evening. Right. We'll end with the chant. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.